My name is Miller Harris. Actually, it's on my birth certificate, it's S. Miller Harris. And my mother wanted her father's name continued. So my birth certificate said S. Miller Harris, which stood for Simon Miller Harris, but she didn't want me called Simon. She wanted me called Miller. My great-grandfather, Jacob Miller, came over from Germany in 1850. And he, like many German Jews, fled military life. And they came here in time for the Civil War. And Jacob Miller was drafted, but he paid somebody $300 to take his place. If right now I could pay someone $300 to take my place, I would gladly do it. My great-grandfather, like many other German Jews, started out as a peddler. He had a horse and wagon and a small department store on it. And he traveled through the farmland of western Pennsylvania, selling to the German farm wives with whom he could communicate, because they both spoke Yiddish. Now they both spoke German. And he sold them fabrics and pots and pans and irons and ironing boards. And he thrived. And in 1867, he opened a factory to start making shirts for the store, a company he called Eagle Shirts. My mother was Prue Miller. She was named after an English novel that Simon Miller and Hetty Miller read on their honeymoon, and it was called Prue and I. My father went to Cornell, to agricultural school, in the class of 1918, and my mother was class of 1920 at Cornell, which is where they met. He graduated as a cheese expert, and he was hired by Swift and Company, the meat packing people. And the reason Swift was in the cheese business was because they owned or rented thousands of refrigerated railroad cars. And the sides of beef hung from the roof, and there's a couple feet free underneath where they put butter and eggs and cheese. And they had a competitive edge because their transportation cost them nothing. He worked for Swift in Philadelphia, and then they promoted him and were going to send him to Chicago to their headquarters. And this was in the days of nuclear families, but before the nuclear bomb. And my grandfather said, I don't want Prue moving to Chicago, come into the shirt business. Well, I was the firstborn, and my mother was pregnant with my brother Donald. Donald was 2 years younger than I am. My sister Ellen was born, she was 7 years younger than I am. Donald was delightful. He had a better sense of humor than I did, and he was warmer than I am, less aloof. My mother was a very warm person whom everybody admired and loved. And my friends, my teenage friends, could talk to her, but couldn't talk to their own parents. She was a ceramist. If you walked around this house, you would see a number of pieces that she made. She had her own wheels. She had her own kiln in the basement. My mother read to me incessantly all of A.A. Milne, Kipling's Just So stories, and I read Ibsen and Strindberg when I was in my early teens, Joseph Conrad, the Austens, the Brontes. Well, I would say that in the first 5 or 6 years of my life, we had Irish maids. And I remember particularly a seamstress whose name was McGonigal. All she was called was McGon. If I did something that displeased McGon, she would say, "I'll put your head between your ears and you'll never get it out." I never played any sport in school until I got to college. What I did do was ride horses. And for 3 years, I rode every day of my life. Every year there was a 4th of July parade down 5th Street. And I led the parade on a white horse. This horse had never seen a trolley car before. So the entire parade, he pranced on his back 2 feet, 2 legs. And I was a sensation. Donald and I slept in the same room. In September of 1939, we were in bed one night. He was asleep, and he was breathing funny, breathing strangely. And I woke up my mother, and she called a doctor who lived 2 blocks from us because he was inexpensive. And he said, "Donald has a cold and he'll get over it." And the next night his breathing was worse, and I went off to college. The night I got there, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and thought that Donald had died. Actually, what had happened was that my mother had called a real doctor, and Donald had flu pneumonia, and the real doctor told her it was too late, and he died that night. The next day or the day after, I looked out my dorm window, and my parents were coming up the walk, and my father was carrying the radio from our bedroom. My parents came into the room and I said, "Donald died." And they just nodded their heads. Both of them were crying. And my mother never forgave herself. Never really ever got over it. Philadelphia German Jewry at that time was like a closed society. There were 2 major synagogues, Rodef Sholem and Knesset Israel. There were 2 Jewish country clubs that were strictly German Jews. One was Philmont and one was Riedel. We belonged to both because my father could play cards at Philmont, and my mother could sit quietly by a natural pool at Riedel with people less flamboyant than Philmont. Mary Louise and I were of those cliques. We also belonged to the same dancing class, and I would dance with Mary Louise. And she was and still is an inveterate eavesdropper. And while we were dancing, she was trying to listen to what was happening with another couple or several other couples. And I thought she was immature. Mary Louise was very beautiful and had many suitors. These suitors would take her to the Ritz roof or whatever was most expensive. And on our first date, I took her to a beer joint and she knitted. Shortly after our first date, Mary Louise went to Wellesley and I went back to Cornell. And I wrote her, everybody in her house at Wellesley read the letters and put them on a bulletin board. Mary Louise's best friend said of my letters, "Miller has a certain facility."
I want to know how you won her over. I want to know, it sounded like she was knitting the whole time.
Well, you're probably a different generation, but in my day, it was easily possible to knit and fuck. Throughout my school life, I had been active in publications, school magazines and newspapers. And I felt that I wanted to be a newspaper man. And they convinced me that Cornell had the best daily newspaper in the country, which it turned out it did. And that's why I went to Cornell. I did everything on the Sun. I covered sports. Cornell was a powerhouse in football. And there was a league, you had to weigh 150 pounds on the Thursday before the game. And I weighed 156, so I had to go into the boiler room and sweat off 6 pounds on Thursday. First string was a guy named Tom Novus, and I played when he got hurt, which wasn't often enough for me and too often for him. I met Kurt when he came out for the Sun. He had the wildest imagination of all of us at Cornell. And there were a lot of good writers at Cornell at that time. Knox Berger, Walt McQuaid, Wally McLaughlin, Kurt. Miller Harris wasn't that bad. I wrote him that whatever he did, he should continue writing. He from time to time called me his mentor. I don't really think I was his mentor. I encouraged him. And he wrote me that he was going to quit his job and write for a living. The market for short fiction was disappearing. The paperback novels now cost $0.25. The television was taking away audience and income from those magazines, and that he should keep his nice job at General Electric, but not give them his mind and write nights and weekends and still have an income. So he quit his job and sold 30 stories in the next year to people like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's. He could write science fiction better than anybody else. And that's what he did for a while.